Welcome to another podcast from Odell Technology. Today we're very fortunate to be joined by Professor Votruba. Hello, Professor.
Hello, and pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I was wondering if I could ask you to describe your professional background, where you and how you ended up where you are today, if that's okay.
It's a pleasure, thank you. I'm a consultant ophthalmologist and I work in Wales at the Cardiff University Health Board and as a professor of ophthalmology at Cardiff University. I've had an interesting career in that as an ophthalmologist, I've chose to specialize in genetics or ophthalmic genetics, which is an up and coming area of huge interest within the specialty. It spans interests in both what's called medical retina and surgical retina. Those are the patients with retinal problems, as well as optic nerve diseases, which are genetic by and large. So I have specialty training, for example, as a fellowship in medical retina. I did my basic training in the United Kingdom at Bristol Eye Hospital and Moorfields Eye Hospital. And then I did a fellowship at the National Institutes of Health with Professor Paul Sieving. And that was in ophthalmic genetics in particular. And I've also been a clinician scientist for a number of years, which means that I have run a laboratory because I did a PhD in my formative years at UCL in London and undertook cell and molecular biology research, looking for a gene that caused a specific disease of the optic nerve. And really, that was my big introduction to molecular biology and genetics and research. And I became so enthusiastic about that, I decided that I would like a career that allowed me to work in the laboratory, supervise students and scientists carrying out cell and biology research, as well as a clinician seeing patients with real life diseases, problems. And in fact, I'm very lucky to be able to do that now. I spend about a third of my week seeing patients and 2/3 doing research and teaching currently.
And the research and teaching, exclusively with the university?
That's right, Cardiff University. In particular, we teach healthcare professionals, for example, optometrists, vision scientists, but also medical students, and we have postgraduate students doing PhDs in the laboratory. My particular area of research interest has continued to be what we call optic neuropathies or diseases of the optic nerve, and in particular, those that are genetic. And by and large, most of those are caused by abnormalities in something called mitochondria. And these are small organelles or little particles within cells that have the capacity to generate energy. Some people call them the battery of the cell, so that they will be able to generate the molecule of energy, which is called ATP, that helps all cells to work. But if these mitochondria go wrong for many different reasons, the energy flux in the cell can be affected, the problems of the cell get worse and worse, the function declines, and eventually the cell may die. So the retina is the part of the eye where the nerve cells reside. It's a bit like the film at the back of a camera. The light comes through, the clear bit at the front is focused by the lens, then it hits the retina. And in those cells, electrical signals arise in so-called rods and cones, and then they go to a cell that's really special to me, the retinal ganglion cell. So this is the cell that's really, really crucial for taking the nerve cells' electrical impulses from the eye to the brain, down the optic nerve. And those are the cells that die in patients who have optic nerve diseases that are genetic. They all seem to hit that cell type. And so our work is designed to understand the genes that cause this, how the proteins that the genes make go wrong, what then happens in the cell, why the cells die, how we could rescue them, what type of therapies or treatments could intervene at an early stage or a later stage. And it's a fascinating area, and it's made progress over the last 15 to 20 years.
So you talk a great deal about genetic research. Are you part of a larger alliance across Europe or the world?
So I'll come back to what genetics really means first in the patients and then how that links to all the work going on internationally, because yes, we're all working towards a common goal. So in the United Kingdom, we've been very fortunate across both England and Wales to have the apparent head start, if you like, in genetic testing for inherited diseases of the eye. We've been doing it for a number of years, and we're in a very good position, actually, to offer patients that come to us through the NHS testing for whichever gene we think might go wrong. And this has been going on for a number of years and has got more and more efficient and rapid and effective, producing results that tell us which gene has been affected in that individual and in their family, because quite often there's an extended family history of a specific condition. I'll give you an example. A common retinal condition, which I would see patients with, is called retinitis pigmentosa. And that affects cells in the retina, predominantly beginning with the cells that are called the rods, and they help us to see in the dark and in the periphery of our vision. And those nerve cells are unfortunately affected by mutations in a whole range of genes, and then they become unwell or sick and die eventually, so that we begin to develop visual defects. So we see patients with that, and we can offer both the diagnosis, which is an accurate clinical diagnosis, which involves examining the eye, examining the field of vision, examining the electrical responses from the eye, examining the back of the eye with high-resolution imaging, which shows us the retina in cross-section and all the abnormalities that we would expect to see. And then we can counsel the patient on what we think the problem is and take a blood sample if they would like to know more about the genetics, and that can be screened for the genes that could be causing it. When we get the result, we can tell the individual what that means, both for them, their family, their future vision, and their children.
Are there different sorts of retinitis pigmentosa?
Yes, as I alluded to, there are actually probably over 100 genes or even more that can cause RP. The number isn't really important, but it's not one disease or one gene, which is why the genetic testing has really taken off since the advent of the ability to sequence the human genome in a cost-effective way. It used to be incredibly expensive and time-consuming and totally unrealistic for a clinical service. But now it's getting better, faster, cheaper, and we can do this for our individual families and patients. And we can then come up with the name of the gene, which in itself, of course, I'll often say to patients, that won't change your life. But what changes is the knowledge that in the future, you need a very accurate diagnosis if new treatments come along. You need to know which gene has gone wrong in your eye so that you might know which new treatment or trial you might be suitable for. At this point, I might like to just mention all of the diseases that we're talking about are so-called rare diseases. And I think I'm very aware that people think, oh, that just means they're not important. And that's absolutely not the case. I'm very passionate about rare diseases because I've realized that patients with rare diseases have had and still probably are having quite a difficult time. So in the EU, rare diseases affect fewer than 1 in 2,000 people, but there are over 6,000 known rare diseases, of which probably about 1,000 can affect the eye. And 1 in 17 people can be affected by a rare disease at some time in their life, which to my mind isn't rare, but individually, all the different genes, of course, are rare. And if it's 1 in 17 people, that amounts to 3.5 million people in the UK. So we have a lot of need, a lot of patients who previously had no information about their disease. It was a mystery, it was genetic, it was not possible to know further. But now we get much more information and we can actually start to think about the possibilities of future treatments, which won't just make the disease a bit better, but could actually change the course of the disease and prevent people from going blind. And rare diseases have been difficult for patients because I think you'll be shocked to hear that there's an estimate which has been done across a range of publications that it's taking sometimes as long as 4 years for people to get an accurate diagnosis of their rare disease. Now, I'd like to think that people who come to see us in the All Wales Ophthalmic Genetics Clinic are not taking 4 years now, but that's across the board with all rare diseases, some of which are exceedingly complex and rare. we're now able to see people and get a diagnosis within a matter of months once we set the ball in motion. On that basis, I think in Wales, what I've tried to do is to bring together all ophthalmic genetic patients where possible through something we're trying to develop, which is the All Wales Ophthalmic Genetic Service, where we can provide the expertise, which requires a number of different individuals to work together. And in the United Kingdom, we're quite lucky. We have specialist ophthalmologists trained in this area in many centres, the larger centres, and patients are able to see somebody with expertise. If they're initially, of course, referred by their GP with some sort of accuracy about what might be going on, they can get to see the right the person quickly. I think it's important to emphasise still there are very few treatments, which is why we do the research in the laboratory.
It's very interesting that I do think that your service is ahead of the game against many of the European countries right now. I'm very pleased it exists. I know a number of people who suffer from retinitis pigmentosa in different countries. You're obviously working with the rare diseases associations in different categories. Retinitis pigmentosa is a very good example. Is there anything else you'd like to mention in the rare disease category?
Well, I do want to acknowledge the very, very good work that's done by the Genetic Alliance UK, which is a place where patients can talk about and get information about genetics, and another association, the Rare Disease UK, which is a part of that. And in addition, I think it's really important that I mention that patients need up-to-date information, and it isn't possible in a one-to-one appointment in the NHS to spend 2 hours going through the cell biology, even if they wanted to do that. However, I'm very, very, very proactive in terms of saying people should go on to specific websites. And Retina UK have developed an absolutely fantastic website, which has been done with professionals and patients, where there is a whole section of multi-layered information about genetics. So, you know, not everybody wants to know everything, but what is a gene? What's a chromosome? What's a mutation? Why have I got this? What's happened? Who can get it? What are the patterns of inheritance? And the patients then can also go to individual eye diseases, retinitis pigmentosa, choroideremia, macular dystrophies, Stargardt's dystrophy. There's a whole range. And that type of information can take a long time to get on board. Having access to it at home is so much better than an out-of-date leaflet that I could just give them in the clinic, which will never encompass that whole level. So I think I always encourage patients to find out as much as possible about their condition. And I would also encourage people to, if we can recruit them into clinical trials, volunteer. Obviously, they have to consider carefully their own situation. So as the information progresses, disease registries are being formed for retinitis pigmentosa, for example, X-linked RP or choroideremia, and then trials will follow, and natural history studies are being done, which means we need to document the exact progression of the disease in individual people in their eye. You'd be surprised to know that just by looking back through people's notes, that's not quite enough. It has to be done in a systematic way. So that's all happening and getting underway. The area where I'm particularly focused is on mitochondrial diseases of the optic nerve. And there have been a couple of really exciting developments, some of which we apply in our clinics, some of which we're watching carefully, and some of which we're trying in the laboratory to do things further. So firstly, we can now diagnose mitochondrial optic neuropathies such as Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, or dominant optic atrophy, with many different genes potentially involved there. We can, in Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, offer in Wales a treatment which has been approved called idebenone, which is available on prescription. It is not approved across some countries in Europe and even in the UK. It's not available in other countries. It is not a cure. It is a supportive therapy, which in some individuals leads to some improvements in vision, and research is still ongoing, looking at the real world experience with this medication, idebenone. But I do have to warn patients not to expect this to reverse their vision loss. So we're monitoring those patients very carefully across Wales, who we've been able to prescribe this in the last year and a half to 2 years maximum it's been available. Secondly, of course, we're watching carefully that patients could potentially enter gene therapy trials, which are recruiting in the United Kingdom for Labour's hereditary optic neuropathy, and have done so through a series of phase 3 studies, which involved extensive investments by a company that's bringing that therapy to market, we hope, but still many issues to be resolved. And that is looking really promising. But again, it's still a new treatment. And I do say to patients, just because you're in a trial doesn't mean you're going to be cured. It's a trial. That's the whole point. And we need to know whether it works and whether it's safe. And then in terms of other treatments, you mentioned the electric therapy, if you like. There is that's something we're watching. I mean, haven't tried that in my laboratory or in my clinics. But there is a red light therapy, which uses 670 nanometer, which is a red stroke near infrared almost light. And it can be applied to the external eye and has a track record of some medical benefits. The use of red light actually began in wound healing when it was noticed that it encouraged wound healing. It also encouraged potentially some improvements in patients who'd had strokes or ischemic problems. And there are many papers published on it in newborns, in stroke patients, and it's also been tested in age-related macular degeneration, where it may have an anti-inflammatory effect and actually slow down the progression. Obviously, all of this still requires trials. It is not a therapy that is absolutely fully understood, and so the side effects have to be considered carefully if there are any, and safety is important. But we're investigating this in a number of ways in the laboratory. The first is to irradiate cells in a dish. So we can take retinal ganglion cells, not from humans, because that's impossible at the moment, indirectly, but from, say, a mouse retina. And we can irradiate the cells and we can show that there's benefit in survival and energy production. We can then also take tissue and irradiate it, such as retinal tissue, and show that the retinal ganglion cells appear to be more resistant to damage. And finally, we can take human-induced pluripotent stem cells, which are derived from usually muscle or skin from people with the disease, and then transformed into pluripotent stem cells, which can then be cultured. And we can, over a protocol of 30 to 40 days, differentiate them, make them like retinal ganglion cells, which is utterly brilliant. I mean, this is work done in many labs now, and we're not at the forefront of that, but it's absolutely fantastic. And it's transforming our ability to test human retinal ganglion cells in a Petri dish with the red light, or with any other drug or therapy, in fact. And that's leading to some major understanding about how the red light could work, and that it could, in fact, be beneficial. And the next steps, obviously, there have been trials in patients with age-related macular degeneration, would be to try it in other conditions. So that's one area of research. The other has been to really think carefully about why the cells in the eye die in the laboratory, and to try to intervene at an earlier stage to rescue them. Because we know that patients with Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy go catastrophically blind over a period of 3 to 6 weeks. First, it would appear in one eye, and then subsequently, 3 months later, the other eye can become affected, which is a devastating thing to happen in an individual who's usually in their late teens or 20s, although it can happen at any age, and is slightly more likely to be male than female, but again, it can happen across the board. And if we could find a way of slowing down or rescuing with a drug or with a light therapy the loss of these ganglion cells, the patient's vision would not plummet, and we'd be able to keep them driving, for example, if it was sufficiently successful. And the thing that you might say is, well, why not just replace these retinal ganglion cells? That's the hardest trick in the book, because that actually means not just putting in the stem cell, but getting it to join up and talk to other cells and then to transmit electrical impulses down the optic nerve, which is a long way. And that's very, very challenging. So that's some work that has been done in other laboratories, still needs a huge amount of work to get it really effective. And we're not doing that work.
It's amazing. I take my hat off to you, because I think you're, when I was researching you, we've been involved in ophthalmology work before. You're probably one of 5 people in the world who've created a unique clinical research organization that specializes in looking at these opportunities. I think that anybody who's got a small CRO, who's got a small biotech or a therapy, should be knocking on your door, because I think Wales presents a wonderful opportunity. Would you agree?
So Wales has some advantages. It has a population that is relatively well characterized, doesn't tend to migrate, but we have a huge diversity as well. So it isn't very sort of non-diverse. So we've got a lot of different people. The good thing is the health service, although strapped for cash and with the usual restraints and constraints on waiting lists, it has a forward-thinking approach and is very inclusive. I'm the Wales ophthalmology specialty lead, which is something that essentially allows me to monitor what trials are going on in ophthalmology in Wales. I'll explain this network. So basically, the National Institutes of Health Research, NIHR in England, and the Health and Care Research Wales together fund the specialty leads in all specialties, whether it be cardiology, hematology, neurology, but ophthalmology is ours, so that within each area we have a specialty lead. So Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then in the UK, it's obviously broken down to huge conurbations. So obviously, we've got London or Manchester or so on. And we meet 3 times to 4 times a year on Zoom at the moment and go through all the portfolio of clinical research trials that are recruiting, whether these are commercial, funded by pharma, or non-commercial, investigator-led. We look at how many patients have been recruited, and we look at the success and the time points. And these are rather boring metrics. But the important thing is to encourage people to come to Wales or to the UK generally and invest in clinical research trials and recruiting patients. Because if our patients don't have access to trials, they're being disadvantaged. Not that every trial will be a success and not that every treatment will be a cure, but the ability to take part in a trial is very empowering. And it also makes that person far, far, far more aware of what they can do. And I find patients who are in trials are really enthusiastic and positive about how this might be cured before they have children or the next generation comes along. And this is a terribly important thing in inherited or genetic diseases. So the specialty leads work together, but we also try to promote what we have in Wales. We have a good infrastructure for research. We have research and development offices. Of course, we have all the ethics in place. And we recently tried to bring things together so that if companies come, they don't have to go to individual hospitals to negotiate contracts for every single clinic they want to visit. We try to have a unified approach through R&D, contracts, costings that are unified across the sector in ophthalmology for specific types of trials. And we hope that encourages investment, which the spin-off is usually that we actually get lots of patient engagement. And once a treatment is available, patients benefit from it much sooner. So I think that's really nice. There is something for the patient in this. It isn't just altruism. But obviously patients have to be very generous with their time, often, coming to trials to be seen.
So the organisation also has a registry. I guess it looks at patient-reported outcomes. It looks at quantifiable information. It looks at various metrics. How is it? Is it an in-house registry that you use? How do you collect the data?
No, I think what we're doing is contributing to registries across different diseases, which are often funded or supported by whether it's charities, other stakeholders, or with the input of a company that has, if you like, that sort of altruistic goal of helping, but at the same time, they know they'll get something out of it in the long term in terms of access to patients. So in rare diseases, by definition, the minute you start to say, we have a treatment, we want to test it, it's a rare disease, where are the patients? Suddenly, you can't find them unless you have a registry or a good clinical service. And that actually is a problem, because you don't want to spend 2 years recruiting patients. As quickly as possible, you'd like to see them, see if they're suitable, eligible for the study, and then begin whatever study involves. So there are registers, for example, being set up for retinitis pigmentosa, but also for patients with Leber's optic neuropathy. And so rare diseases are flourishing in terms of their interest, because previously it was difficult to get new drugs to be developed if it appeared that there'd only be a small number of people who would benefit, and a company can't really invest millions and then not be able to sell a drug at all, or a new treatment or gene therapy. But it has become the case that it is obviously now a niche area of huge interest, potentially with small biotech startups and companies that are essentially focusing on really closely defined disease areas. For example, mitochondrial disease or optic nerve diseases or gene therapies. So I'm hoping that in my lifetime, we do start to see some real tangible therapies. And the first one is already out there. So the NHS and worldwide approved 3 years ago a gene therapy for children with a genetic eye disease called LCA, Leber's congenital amaurosis. This is a genetic condition which starts very early in infancy and causes severe, profound vision loss, blindness. And this is approved by NICE and on the NHS, available. And our patients throughout the UK are receiving this. We are recruiting through the national centres that are delivering it, and our patients in Wales have been able to join these treatments. So there is hope, there is a precedent, and there is progress, but of course, it's always a little slower than one would hope.
Absolutely. I really wanted to thank you very much for your time today and the effort the energy that you've given to this meeting. I really believe you're actually doing something very useful and meaningful with your operation in Wales. And I hope to be able to do this again in another 6 months or 7 months.
That's really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much.